Alexander Volkov stood at the window of his penthouse, looking out at the panorama of New York City. His silhouette was clearly visible against the setting sun, coloring the skyscrapers in shades of gold and purple. In his 45 years, he had achieved everything he could have dreamed of. His technology company, Volktech, was one of the largest in the world. His fortune was in the billions, and his name was on the cover of business magazines. But today, something was wrong. Alexander felt a heaviness in his chest that had nothing to do with his usual stress of running an empire. It was something physical. "Maybe I'm just tired," he muttered to himself, massaging his left arm. A sudden wave of dizziness made him stagger. The ringing of the phone interrupted his thoughts. His personal assistant's name popped up on the screen. "Yes, Jessica," answered Alexander, trying to make his voice sound normal. "Mr. Volkov, just a reminder about the board meeting tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. There has also been a request for an interview from the Wall Street Journal. They would like to discuss your expansion plans in Asia." Alexander closed his eyes for a moment. The thought of tomorrow filled with endless meetings and interviews caused him almost physical pain. "Jessica, cancel all my meetings for the coming week," he said suddenly, even to himself. "But, sir, the council meeting—" "I said all meetings," Alexander repeated firmly. Tell them I've gone abroad on urgent business." "Whatever you say, Mr. Volkov. Do you need anything else?" Alexander thought for a moment. "Yes. Find me information on the best hospitals in the city, but not the elite clinics for the rich, but the ordinary ones, the ones where ordinary people go." "Ordinary people, sir?" You could hear the surprise in Jessica's voice. "Exactly, and keep it a closely guarded secret." Hanging up the phone, Alexander turned back to the window. His reflection in the glass looked pale and tired. "Time to find out how the other half lives," he whispered, looking at the lights of the city below. The next morning, Alexander Volkov, dressed in worn jeans and a simple T-shirt, walked into the emergency room of St. Mary's City Hospital. His usually perfectly styled hair was disheveled and his face sported 3 days' worth of stubble. "Can I help you?" the nurse at the front desk asked, not even looking up from her computer. "Yeah, I'm having chest pains," Alexander said, trying to sound unsure. "And dizziness." The nurse looked up, giving him a quick appraising glance. "Name?" "Alex. Alex Wolf," he replied, using a prearranged fake name. "Insurance?" Alexander pulled out the fake insurance card he'd managed to get through his connections. "Here you go." The nurse took the card, entering the data into the computer. "Have a seat, Mr. Wolf. The doctor will examine you as soon as he's free." Alexander sat down in the crowded waiting room, looking around with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. An elderly man was coughing next to him, and a couple chairs away, a young mother was soothing a crying baby. "First time here?" his neighbor asked, noticing Alexander looking around nervously. "Yes," nodded Alexander. "Do you come to hospitals often?" The man grinned. "More often than I'd like. I'm Frank, by the way." "Alex," Alexander introduced himself, shaking the outstretched hand. "So what brings you here, Alex?" inquired Frank. Alexander hesitated for a moment. "Chest pains. Probably just stress from work, but thought I'd check it out." Frank nodded. "Better to be reassured. What do you do?" "Yeah, work in IT," Alexander lied, remembering his legend. "And you?" "Oh, I'm retired now," Frank replied. "Used to work as a bus driver. 30 years behind the wheel, can you imagine?" Alexander shook his head, trying to imagine such a life. "It must have been interesting." "You bet it was," laughed Frank. "I could tell you so many stories. Here's one once." But Frank had no time to begin his story, for at that moment a nurse appeared from behind the door. "Alex Wolf?" she called out. Alexander stood up. "It's me." Come with me, the nurse said. Good luck, kid, Frank encouraged him. Don't worry, you'll be taken care of here. Alexander nodded his thanks and followed the nurse. She led him into a small office and began taking his blood pressure and temperature. So you say you have chest pains? She asked, writing down the readings. Yes, and sometimes dizzy, Alexander replied. The nurse frowned. How long has this been going on? A few days, Alexander lied, remembering his attack yesterday. Okay, Dr. Thompson will examine you soon, the nurse said. Wait here. Left alone, Alexander began to look around the office. He noticed the worn edges of the furniture, the outdated equipment. It was all in stark contrast to the luxurious private clinics he was used to. After a few minutes, the door opened and Dr. Thompson walked in, a woman in her mid-40s with a tired but kind face. Mr. Wolf? She held out her hand. I'm Dr. Sarah Thompson. What's troubling you? Alexander repeated his symptoms, watching the doctor's reaction. Dr. Thompson listened to him carefully, asking clarifying questions. Do you work a lot, Alex? She asked, finishing her examination. Yes, quite a lot, Alexander admitted. Why? Your symptoms could indicate stress or overwork, Dr. Thompson said. But given your chest pains, I'd like to run more tests to rule out heart problems. Will you be able to stay in the hospital for a couple days? Alexander was confused for a moment. He hadn't planned on staying that long. But then he thought it would be a great opportunity to get a better look at the hospital's operations from the inside. Yes, of course, he nodded. If you think it's necessary. Excellent, Dr. Thompson smiled. I'll arrange for you to be placed in a room. We'll run an EKG and some blood tests. Don't worry, Mr. Wolf, we'll figure it all out. An hour later, Alexander was already lying in a hospital bed in a shared room for 4. Next to him was his new acquaintance from the emergency room, Frank. Hey, Alex, exclaimed Frank upon seeing him. What a meeting. They decided to keep you too? Alexander nodded, getting comfortable on the hard hospital bed. Yeah, the doctor wants to run some tests. Welcome to the club, Frank grinned. I've been stuck here for a week. The doctors can't figure out what's wrong with me. And how do you stand it? Asked Alexander, looking around the dreary walls of the room. Frank shrugged. What's there to do? At least the food is free. Although, to be honest, the food here is pretty bad. At that moment, a young nurse entered the room with a clipboard in hand. Good afternoon, gentlemen, he said. I'm Michael. I'll be your nurse on this shift. Mr. Wolf, I'm here to take your blood for testing. Alexander held out his hand, watching Michael deftly work the needle and test tubes. How long have you worked here, Michael? Asked Alexander, trying to strike up a conversation. 3 years now, replied Michael, not taking his eyes off his work. Why, is it noticeable? Just wondering, shrugged Alexander. And what do you think? Michael looked up for a second, meeting Alexander's gaze. It can be a lot of different things. It's not an easy job, but someone has to do it, right? Right, Alexander agreed. And what kind of problems do you usually encounter? Michael finished drawing blood and straightened up, looking at Alexander thoughtfully. You know, Mr. Wolf, for a man with chest pains, you ask some pretty unusual questions. Alexander felt the color rush to his face. I'm just curious. Uh-huh, Michael hummed. Well, if you're really curious, the main problem is a shortage of everything. Staff, equipment, medicine. We do what we can, but sometimes it's just not enough. And what's keeping these problems from being solved? Asked Alexander, feeling the businessman in him waking up. Money, Mr. Wolf, replied Michael with a bitter chuckle. It's always about money, but I'm sure that's clear enough to an IT man. With those words, Michael gathered his things and headed for the exit. Hey, Michael, Frank called out to him. When do I get my test results back? Soon, Mr. Douglas, Michael replied. Dr. Thompson promised to come by and see you tonight. As Michael left, Frank turned to Alexander. Not a bad guy, is he? A little cynical, but generally caring. Alexander nodded, immersed in his own thoughts. The conversation with Michael had made him think about a lot of things. "You know, Alex," Frank continued, "I've been watching this hospital here for a week now. And you know what I'll tell you? These guys are heroes. They work 24 hours a day, practically no weekends for pennies, and still manage to stay human." "Yeah, that's impressive," Alexander agreed. "Do you have any idea why the situation is so complicated?" Frank grinned, making himself comfortable on his bed. "Oh boy, it's a long story. See, the problem isn't just this particular hospital. It's a systemic problem." Alexander pitched forward, his curiosity genuine. "What do you mean?" "You see, our healthcare system, it's like an old jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces are lost, and the remaining pieces don't always fit together," Frank began to explain. "On one hand, we have cutting-edge technology and brilliant minds. On the other, millions of people who can't afford basic health care." Alexander frowned. "But aren't there government programs? Insurance?" "There are, of course," Frank nodded. "But it's like trying to cover a hole in a dam with gum. It helps temporarily, but it doesn't solve the problem." At that moment, a nurse entered the room, pushing a cart with trays in front of her. "Dinner, gentlemen," she announced, handing out trays. Alexander stared at his portion in bewilderment. On the plate was something remotely resembling chicken, with a lump of mashed potatoes and some cooked vegetables next to it. "Enjoy your meal," the nurse said without much enthusiasm, and left the room. Frank, noticing the look on Alexander's face, laughed. "What, doesn't look like a five-star hotel restaurant, huh?" Alexander tasted a piece of chicken and struggled to hold back a grimace. "It's edible," he pronounced diplomatically. "Hey, no need to get so worked up," Frank encouraged him. "You know what I'll tell you? When I was young, I worked in a little diner, and there was this waitress, Maggie. Now, she'd always say, 'Frankie, honey, the food isn't the point. It's the company you share it with,' and you know what? She was right." Alexander smiled, feeling the tension release a little. "Your Maggie was a wise woman." "Oh yes," Frank nodded with a nostalgic smile. "She taught me a lot of things. You know what else she was right about? She always said to appreciate the simple things. I mean, look at this. We're sitting here right now, eating this. Let's call it food. But we're alive. We have a roof over our heads, and someone's taking care of our health. A lot of people can only dream of that too." Alexander chewed thoughtfully, pondering Frank's words. To him, accustomed to luxury and comfort, this situation was a revelation. "And you're an optimist, Frank," he remarked. "I have to be," shrugged Frank. "You know, when you're over 60 and you spend more time in hospitals than at home, optimism isn't a luxury, it's a necessity." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Dr. Thompson entered the room, holding a clipboard. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said hello. "How are you feeling?" "Good as new, Doc," Frank echoed. "Especially after that culinary masterpiece." He nodded at the nearly untouched tray. Dr. Thompson smiled weakly. "I'll pass on your compliments to the chef." She turned to Alexander. "And you, Mr. Wolf, how are you feeling?" "Fine," Alexander replied. "The chest pains have not recurred." "That's good," the doctor nodded. "We've received the results of your first tests. So far, everything looks within normal limits, but I'd like to run a couple more tests tomorrow morning." "Of course," Alexander agreed. "What about Frank? Do you have any news for him?" Dr. Thompson shifted her gaze to Frank, and her face tensed a little. "Mr. Douglas, I'd like to speak to you privately. Would you mind coming with me?" Frank frowned but nodded. "Sure, Doc. Give me a minute." When Frank and Dr. Thompson left the room, Alexander was alone. He leaned back on his pillow, trying to digest everything he had learned that day. Thoughts swarmed in his head, jumping from one topic to another. After a while, the door opened again, and Frank walked in. His face was pale and his eyes read worry. Frank? Is everything all right? Asked Alexander, raising himself on the bed. Frank sank heavily onto his bed. Not really, Alex. I seem to have bigger problems than we thought. Alexander felt his heart clench. What did the doctor say? Frank took a deep breath. They found a tumor in the lungs. Dr. Thompson says they need to do a biopsy to see if it's benign or, you know. Frank, I'm so sorry. Alexander didn't know what to say. He'd never dealt with a situation like this so closely. Hey, don't bury me before my time, Frank tried to joke, but his smile came out strained. You know what the lousy part is? I can't even afford all these tests and treatments. My insurance only covers basic treatments. Alexander felt anger building up inside him. How is this possible? After all, we're talking about your life. Frank grinned bitterly. Welcome to the real world, Alex. Here, your life is worth exactly what you can pay for it. Those words hit Alexander like a slap in the face. He suddenly became acutely aware of how far removed he had been from the problems of ordinary people all this time. There must be some way out of this, he muttered. Sure there is, nodded Frank. I could sell the house I've been saving up all my life. Or take out a loan I'll never be able to pay back. Or just hope for a miracle. At that moment, Michael entered the room. He quickly assessed the situation and approached Frank. Mr. Douglas, how are you? He asked with genuine concern. I've been better, son, Frank replied. But that's okay. We'll get through this. Michael nodded and began checking the instrument readings. Alexander watched him work, noting the professionalism and care with which the nurse treated the patient. Michael, Alexander called out when he was finished. May I ask you a question? Of course, Mr. Wolf, Michael replied, approaching his bedside. You were talking about the problems at the hospital, about the lack of resources. What do you think needs to be done to make a difference? Michael thought for a moment. You know, Mr. Wolf, it's a complicated issue. On the one hand, we need more funding, new equipment, more staff, better conditions for patients. But it's not just about money. What else is it about? Asked Alexander, listening intently. It's about the system, Michael replied. We need healthcare reform. One that will make healthcare available to everyone, not just those who can afford it. We need people like Mr. Douglas to not be afraid of going broke because of illness. Alexander nodded, feeling a plan begin to form in his head. What if there was someone who could invest in this hospital, help with equipment, staff? Michael grinned. That would be wonderful, Mr. Wolf. But there aren't many such benefactors. Most rich people prefer to invest in private clinics rather than city hospitals. And if such a man were found, insisted Alexander, what would you advise him to do first? Michael looked at Alexander carefully, as if trying to solve a riddle. Well, if such a person really wanted to help, I would advise him to start by talking to the hospital administration, learn about the most pressing problems, and then we could think about setting up a fund to help patients who can't afford expensive treatment. Alexander nodded, mentally jotting down these ideas. Thank you, Michael. You've given me a lot of food for thought. You're welcome, Mr. Wolf, Michael replied, heading for the exit. Although I must admit, for an IT professional, you ask some very unusual questions. As Michael walked away, Frank turned to Alexander. You know, Alex, you surprise me. Most people in your position would only think about getting out of here as quickly as possible, and you seem to be seriously interested in the hospital's problems. Alexander shrugged, trying to look casual. Just curious, that's all. Besides, who knows, maybe that knowledge will come in handy one day. Maybe, Frank nodded. You know what I'll tell you? The world is held together by people like Michael, on people who come here every day and do their job despite the odds. They're the real heroes. Alexander nodded silently, looking out the window at the city at night. The lights of the skyscrapers twinkled in the darkness, reminding him of the life he had temporarily left behind. But right now, that life seemed distant and a little unreal to him. The next morning started early. Alexander was awakened by a nurse who had come to draw blood for a test. "Good morning, Mr. Wolf," she said as she prepared the instruments. "How are you feeling?" "Fine," Alexander replied, holding out his hand. "And you? How's your shift?" The nurse raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Thanks for asking. It's been a rough night. Lots of emergency patients. But it's okay. We're managing." While she drew blood, Alexander looked around the room. Frank was still asleep, his face looking calm and peaceful in his sleep. "Tell me," Alexander began as the nurse finished, "do you often have such busy nights?" "More often than I'd like," the nurse sighed, removing the vials of blood into a special container. She paused for a moment, as if deciding whether to continue the conversation. "You know, Mr. Wolf, when I went into medicine, I thought I would be saving lives, helping people. And I really do. But sometimes it feels like we're trying to scoop out the ocean with a teaspoon." Alexander looked at her carefully. The weariness was evident in her every movement, in the shadows under her eyes. "It must be very hard," he said quietly. The nurse smiled weakly. "It happens in different ways. Sometimes you go home feeling like you've done something really important, and sometimes—" She shook her head. "I'm sorry, Mr. Wolf. I shouldn't be complaining to patients." No, it's all right," Alexander hastened to assure her. "Yeah, I appreciate your candor." At that moment, Frank's voice came from the next bed. "Hey, lovebirds, haven't you forgotten about me?" The nurse laughed, and the weariness on her face receded a little. "How could I forget about you, Mr. Douglas? You are my favorite patient." "Oh, I knew my charm would not leave you indifferent," winked Frank. "How would you like to run away with me? I promise a romantic dinner in the hospital cafeteria. I'll even share my Jell-O." "The temptation is great, Mr. Douglas," the nurse replied, playing along, "but I'm afraid my husband would object." "Ah, those lucky ones who got there first," sighed Frank theatrically. "Well then, I have only your professional care to console me." The nurse shook her head, smiling. "You are incorrigible, Mr. Douglas. Now let's check your vitals." While she tended to Frank, Alexander watched their interaction. It was obvious that in the days Frank had spent in the hospital, he had made friends with the staff. His jokes and easy attitude about his condition seemed to lift the spirits of not only himself, but those around him as well. "So, nurse, will I live?" asked Frank when the nurse had finished measuring. "With your sense of humor? You bet you will," she replied. "Dr. Thompson will be stopping by later to discuss the results of yesterday's tests." Frank's face turned serious for a moment, but he quickly regained his carefree look. "Great. I love good news in the morning, especially if it's served with a cup of coffee." "Mr. Douglas, you know you can't have coffee yet," the nurse reminded him. "Ah, yes. Those cruel restrictions," sighed Frank. "Well then, I'll be content with your charming smile. It's as invigorating as caffeine." The nurse shook her head, but it was evident that she was pleased. "Rest well, Mr. Douglas, and you, Mr. Wolf. Breakfast will be here soon." When she left, Frank turned to Alexander. "So, Alex, ready for another culinary adventure?" Alexander smiled. "I'm not sure my stomach has recovered from last night's dinner." "Oh, don't be so picky," Frank winked. "You know, when I was young and traveling around the country, I had to eat worse. I remember once in Texas." But Frank didn't have time to finish his story, for Michael entered the room carrying a tray. "Good morning, gentlemen," he said, "hello. I hope you're ready for breakfast." "Ah, Michael, my savior," exclaimed Frank. "Say, what's on the menu today? Chef's omelet? Croissants with jam?" Michael grinned, setting out the trays. "I'm afraid to disappoint you, Mr. Douglas, but today we have oatmeal and toast. There's orange juice, though." "Oh, what luxury!" Frank sighed theatrically. "Michael, you spoil us." Alexander watched this exchange of remarks with a mixture of surprise and admiration. Despite his diagnosis and the uncertainty of his future, Frank managed to remain optimistic and even lift the spirits of those around him. "And you, Mr. Wolf?" addressed Michael. "How are you feeling today?" "Fine, thank you," Alexander replied. "Michael, may I ask you a question?" "Sure," the nurse nodded, taking a seat on the edge of Alexander's bed. "You've been working here for several years now. What makes you stay, despite the challenges?" Michael thought for a moment. "You know, Mr. Wolf, that's not an easy question. There are days when I ask myself the same thing, especially after a tough shift, when it seems like you're giving it your all and you can't see results." "And what do you answer yourself?" asked Alexander, pitching forward. "I remember the faces of the people we've helped," Michael replied. "I remember the patient who got back on his feet for the first time after a serious injury, or the child who beat leukemia, or the elderly woman who recovered from a stroke and was able to recognize her grandchildren." He paused. "It's moments like that when you realize that everything is not in vain." "That's right," Frank interjected. "Our Michael is a real hero, though he'll never admit it in his life." Michael smiled embarrassedly. "I'm just doing my job, Mr. Douglas." "And doing it damn well," Frank confirmed. "You know, Alex, when I first got here, I was in a terrible state, not just physically, but mentally. And you know who helped keep me up? This guy right here." He nodded at Michael. Alexander shifted his gaze from Frank to Michael, feeling the respect for these men growing inside him. "It must be very challenging to face the pain and suffering of others every day," he pronounced. "Not easy," Michael agreed. "But you know what the hardest part is? Seeing people suffer not only from illness but also from a flawed system. When a patient can't get the treatment they need because they don't have insurance, or when we have to deny care because of a lack of resources." "And that happens often?" asked Alexander, feeling anger building up inside him. Michael sighed. "More often than you can imagine, Mr. Wolf. Here, for example, is the case of Mr. Douglas." Hey, just don't make me a victim of circumstance," Frank interrupted him. "I'll fight my way back, you'll see." "Of course you will," smiled Michael. "You're a real fighter, Mr. Douglas." At that moment, Dr. Thompson entered the room. Her face was serious, and Alexander felt everyone in the room tense up. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said hello. "Mr. Douglas, I have your test results. Are you ready to discuss them?" Frank straightened up on the bed, his usual smile gone. "Sure, Doc. Spit it out. I'm ready for anything." Dr. Thompson crouched on the edge of his bed. "Mr. Douglas, the biopsy results confirmed our fears. You have stage 3 lung cancer." A heavy silence hung in the room. Alexander felt his breath catch. He looked at Frank, expecting to see despair or fear, but the older man's face remained calm. "Well then," Frank finally uttered, "at least now we know what we're dealing with. What are our options, Doc?" Dr. Thompson began to explain the possible treatments, talking about chemotherapy, radiation therapy, and possible surgery. Alexander listened, feeling a mixture of emotions building up inside him: anger, compassion, helplessness. "Now let's talk about the elephant in the room," Frank said when the doctor finished. "How much is all this going to cost?" Dr. Thompson hesitated. "Mr. Douglas, let's focus on your treatment first. We can discuss financial matters later." "No way, let's discuss them now," Frank insisted. "I don't want to harbor false hopes. How much?" The doctor named the amount, and Alexander felt dizzy. To him, a billionaire, the amount was insignificant, but to a man like Frank it meant financial disaster. "Oh well," Frank sighed after a long pause. "Looks like I'm going to have to sell my kidney. Do you think they'll give me much for it, Doc?" "Mr. Douglas, please don't joke like that," Dr. Thompson said softly. "We'll find a way to help you. There are patient assistance programs, charities." Yes, I know," nodded Frank. "Don't worry, Doc. I haven't given up yet. Just need some time to digest all this." Dr. Thompson looked at him sympathetically. Of course, Mr. Douglas. We can discuss the details later when you're ready. In the meantime, rest and regain your strength. When she left, a heavy silence hung in the chamber. Alexander looked at Frank, not knowing what to say. How to comfort a man who had just found out he had cancer and yet couldn't afford treatment? "Hey, Alex," Frank finally uttered, turning to him. "Don't look at me like I've already got one foot in the grave. I'll still fight, you'll see." "I know, Frank," Alexander nodded. "You're a strong man, but it's not fair. You shouldn't have to go through this alone." Frank smiled weakly. "Life is rarely fair at all, kid, but you know what? I've lived a good life. I've had a loving wife, wonderful kids. I've seen the world, met interesting people, and now I've met you." Alexander felt a lump come up to his throat. "Frank, No, no need for pity," Frank interrupted him, waving his hand. "Better tell me something. Distract me. How's it going in the IT world? Any new gadgets invented?" Alexander was confused for a moment but quickly pulled himself together. "Well, technology doesn't stand still. Here, for example, they've recently developed a new chip that can speed up computers considerably." "Really?" wondered Frank. "And how does it work?" Alexander began to explain, trying to speak in simple language and avoiding technical terms. He talked about quantum computing, artificial intelligence, virtual reality. Frank listened with genuine interest, asking questions and making comments. "You know, Alex," Frank said after a long conversation, "you don't look like a normal IT guy. There's something about you I don't know how to explain it. You talk about these technologies like you really understand how they can change the world." Alexander felt his heart beat faster. He was on the verge of revealing his true identity. But at that moment, Michael entered the room. "How are you gentlemen doing?" he asked, checking the readings on the instruments. "Mr. Douglas, how are you feeling after your conversation with Dr. Thompson?" Frank shrugged. "I've been better, Michael. But you know me, I can't be broken that easily." Michael nodded, his face expressing sympathy. "You're a strong man, Mr. Douglas, and we're all here to support you." "Thanks, son," Frank smiled. "You know what bothers me the most right now? Not the illness itself, but how I'm going to pay for it all. I've tried to be responsible all my life, save for a rainy day, but this kind of expense, it's beyond me." Michael sat down on the edge of the bed. "Mr. Douglas, I know this is hard, but let's think together. There are various assistance programs, charitable foundations. We can contact the hospital social services. They can help sort out the options." "What if—" began Alexander, but stopped short. He almost offered to pay for Frank's treatment, forgetting his role. "What if what, Alex?" asked Frank, turning to him. Alexander quickly thought of another option. "What if we organize a fundraiser, over the internet? I've heard of campaigns like that. Sometimes they raise substantial sums." Michael nodded thoughtfully. "That's a good idea, Mr. Wolf. Crowdfunding can really help. But it requires being able to tell a story to get people's attention." "I can help with that," Alexander said quickly. "I have experience in social media. I could set up a campaign." Frank looked at Alexander with surprise. "You'd do that for me? But we barely know each other." Alexander felt tears come to his eyes. "Frank, I've gotten to know you better in these 2 days than some of the people I've talked to over the years. You deserve a chance to heal, and I want to help." "Oh boy," Frank sighed. "You have no idea how much this means to me." At that moment, Dr. Thompson entered the room. She looked around the gathered company in surprise. "I see you have a concilium here," she said with a slight smile. "Mr. Douglas, how are you feeling?" "Better, Doc," Frank replied. "Especially after finding out I have such wonderful friends." Dr. Thompson nodded. "The support of loved ones is very important in the healing process. Mr. Douglas, I'm here to discuss with you the details of your upcoming therapy. Are you ready?" "Always ready, Doc," Frank replied. "Go ahead and lay it out like it is." Dr. Thompson began to explain the treatment plan, talking about chemotherapy courses, possible surgery, side effects. Alexander and Michael listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "Now, let's talk about the financial side of things," Dr. Thompson said, finishing her explanation. "Mr. Douglas, I know this is not an easy subject for you, but I want you to know that we will do everything we can to help you get the treatment you need." Frank nodded. "Thanks, Doc. I appreciate that, but let's be realistic. I can't afford such expensive treatment." "We can discuss installment payment options," Dr. Thompson offered. "Besides, as I said, there are various assistance programs available. And we're also thinking of organizing an online fundraiser," Alexander interjected. "I'm willing to take on that." Dr. Thompson looked at him in surprise. "That's very noble of you, Mr. Wolf. That kind of support from someone you've only known for a couple days, it's impressive." Alexander shrugged, feeling a little awkward. "I'm just doing what I think is right." "You know, Doc," Frank said, "I've always considered myself lucky. Lived a good life, met some great people. And now, even though I'm in the hospital with this diagnosis, I keep meeting amazing people. Maybe that's the secret to happiness. Not what happens to you, but who is there for you in times of need." There was silence in the ward for a moment. Everyone pondered Frank's words. "You are a wise man, Mr. Douglas," Dr. Thompson said at last. "And I'm sure with that kind of support and attitude, you have a good chance of beating the disease." "Thanks, Doc," smiled Frank. "You know, I've been thinking, maybe I should write a book. How to make friends and influence people while lying in a hospital bed. Do you think it would be a bestseller?" Everyone laughed, and the tension in the room eased a little. "I'd buy a book like that," Michael said, "especially if it had your travel stories in it, Mr. Douglas." "Oh, I could tell you about them for hours," winked Frank. "Here, for instance, I had an incident in New Orleans." And Frank began to tell another story from his adventurous life. Alexander listened, watching the reactions of the others. He saw Dr. Thompson's shoulders gradually relaxing, Michael smiling, Frank's own eyes lighting up. At that moment, Alexander made a decision. He's not just going to help Frank with his treatment. He will use his resources and influence to change the healthcare system, so that no person would ever find themselves in a situation where they couldn't afford the treatment they needed. But first, a more pressing problem had to be solved. When Frank finished his story and Dr. Thompson left, Alexander turned to Michael. "Michael, you were talking about the hospital's social services. Would it be possible to arrange a meeting with them? I'd like to discuss all the options available to help Mr. Douglas." Michael nodded. "Of course, Mr. Wolf. I can arrange a meeting for tomorrow, but pardon me for being blunt, why are you so interested in this? You're a patient yourself, after all." Alexander hesitated for a moment, but then decided to be as honest as he could in his situation. "You know, Michael, I've worked for years thinking only of myself and my career. And here at the hospital, for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could do something really important, to help someone, not for profit, but just because it's the right thing to do." Frank looked at Alexander carefully. "You know, Alex, I sensed from the beginning that you were an unusual guy, and now I'm finally convinced of it." Alexander felt the color rush to his cheeks. "I'm just doing what I have to do," he muttered. "No, boy," Frank shook his head. "You're doing a lot more than that. And you know what? Regardless of how my story ends, I'm grateful to fate for bringing me together with you." Alexander felt a lump come up to his throat. He wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. Instead, he just nodded, hoping Frank would understand without words. Michael, who had been watching the scene, said quietly, "I'll arrange a meeting with social services for tomorrow. In the meantime, get some rest. You both need your strength." When Michael left, there was a cozy silence in the room. Frank leaned back on the pillows, covering his eyes. Alexander looked out the window at the city that seemed so distant and foreign now. He thought about his former life, the decisions he had made, the people he had met, and realized that those 2 days in the hospital had changed him more than all the previous years. "Hey, Alex," Frank said suddenly, without opening his eyes. "You know what I'm thinking about right now?" "About what?" asked Alexander. "About how strangely life works. Here I am, a simple pensioner, lying here with lung cancer. And next to me is you, young, successful. And for some reason, you're the one who decided to help me. Why, Alex? Why me?" Alexander took a deep breath. "Frank, you're not just some random retiree. You're a man who taught me more about life in 2 days than I've learned in years. You've shown me what it means to be strong in the face of adversity, what true optimism is. And, I don't think it's me helping you. It's you helping me." Frank opened his eyes and looked at Alexander carefully. "You know, kid, there's some mystery in your words. You sound like a man who has seen a lot in life, yet is only now beginning to truly understand it. Who are you really, Alex?" Alexander felt his heart beat faster. He was on the verge of revealing his true identity. But at that moment, a nurse came into the room on her evening rounds. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said, checking the instrument readings. "How are you feeling?" "Oh, fine," exclaimed Frank with feigned enthusiasm, "especially in anticipation of another culinary masterpiece from your dining room. Tell me, are we in for a rubber stew or cardboard cutlets today?" The nurse laughed. "Mr. Douglas, you are incorrigible, but I'll make you happy. Today we're having chicken soup, real chicken soup." "Wow," marveled Frank feignedly. "You intrigue me. Does the chicken know it's in the soup?" Alexander couldn't hold back a smile as he watched this exchange of remarks. Even in such a difficult situation, Frank managed to joke and lift the spirits of those around him. When the nurse left, Frank turned back to Alexander. "So where were we? Oh yeah, you were going to tell me who you really are." Alexander hesitated for a moment. He realized that it would be difficult to hide the truth any further, but he wasn't ready to reveal it fully just yet either. "Frank," he began cautiously, "you're right. I'm not exactly who I say I am. The truth is, I hold a senior position in a major technology company, and I have certain resources that I can use to help you and maybe make a difference in the bigger picture." Frank whistled. "That's quite a turnaround. And what brings you to our humble abode, Mr. Big Shot?" Alexander sighed. I wanted to find out how ordinary people live, to understand the problems they face with the healthcare system. And you know what? What I've seen here has opened my eyes to a lot of things." "And what did you see?" asked Frank, looking closely at Alexander. "I saw a system that doesn't work the way it should," Alexander replied. "I saw people like you who can't get the treatment they need because of the cost. I saw dedicated healthcare providers who give their best, but still can't help everyone in need. And I realized I had to do something about it." Frank was silent for a long time, pondering what he had heard. Finally he said, "You know, Alex, or whatever your real name is, I've met a lot of different people in my life. Rich ones, poor ones, successful ones, unsuccessful ones. But you're special. You could have just written a check and forgotten all about it. But instead, you came here to understand the problem from the inside. That's impressive." Alexander felt tears come to his eyes. "Thank you, Frank. Your words mean a lot to me." At that moment, Michael entered the room with a tray of dinner. "Here's the promised chicken soup, gentlemen. Enjoy." Frank rubbed his hands together with exaggerated enthusiasm. "Oh, I'm already anticipating this gastronomic adventure. Michael, buddy, would you like to join our banquet?" Michael grinned. "Thanks for the invitation, Mr. Douglas, but I'm on shift. Maybe next time." When Michael left, Frank turned to Alexander. "So, Mr. Mysterious Personality, shall we try this masterpiece of hospital cuisine?" Alexander nodded, taking a spoon. He tasted the soup and was pleasantly surprised. It tasted quite tolerable. You know, Frank, it's not bad. Better than last night's dinner, at least. Ha! Exclaimed Frank. See what our hospital life has brought you to? Already you're enjoying soup that you probably wouldn't even try in normal life. Alexander thought for a moment. Frank was right. A week ago he wouldn't have touched such a meal, but now this simple chicken soup seemed quite tasty to him. You know, Frank, Alexander said, I think that's one of the things I've learned here. To appreciate the simple things. Frank nodded. That's right, kid. Life is made up of little things. And when you start appreciating them, you become truly rich. They continued eating in cozy silence. Alexander pondered Frank's words. He thought back to his lavish meals at expensive restaurants and suddenly realized that this simple dinner in his hospital room was more satisfying. Frank, Alexander began after a pause, I want to offer you something. But before I do, I want you to know that you don't have to do anything. You can refuse and I'll understand. Frank set aside his spoon and looked at Alexander carefully. Now, spill it out. What's the mysterious offer? Alexander took a deep breath. I want to pay for your treatment, in full. Whatever it takes, chemotherapy, surgery, rehab, I'll cover all the costs. Frank froze, his eyes widening in surprise. Are you serious? But why? You don't know me at all. I know enough, Alexander replied. I know you're a good person who deserves a chance to get better, and I know that if I can help, I should do it. Frank was silent for a long time, digesting what he had heard. Finally he said, You know, Alex, or whatever your real name is, I've lived a long life, and I've learned to trust my intuition. And now it's telling me that you're not just some rich weirdo who decided to play charity. There's something about you. Real. Alexander felt a lump come up to his throat. Thank you, Frank. That means a lot to me. But, Frank continued, I can't just accept a gift like that. It's too much. Frank, Alexander said softly, it's not as much to me as you think, and I don't expect anything in return. Just let me help. Frank scratched his chin thoughtfully. You know what? Let's do it this way. I'll accept your help, but on one condition. What's that? Asked Alexander. Not only will you pay for my treatment, said Frank. You'll use your resources and influence to help other people in a similar situation. You'll set up a foundation, or whatever it is you rich people do, and you'll help those who can't afford treatment. Alexander felt his heart fill with warmth. Frank, this is exactly what I was going to do. I want to change the system, make medical care available to everyone. That's great, Frank nodded. Then we have a deal. You help me, and I help you become a better person. Deal? Deal, Alexander smiled, extending his hand. They shook hands, and in that moment Alexander felt like his life had changed forever. He had come to this hospital thinking he would observe the lives of ordinary people from the outside, but instead he found a friend and found a new purpose in life. The next morning Alexander woke up early. He felt an extraordinary surge of energy and determination. Today was the day he would begin to put his plan into action. Good morning, Frank, he said, noticing that his roommate was also awake. How are you feeling? Frank turned to him with a smile. Good morning, Mr. Mysterious Personality. You know, I feel better than I have in the last few days. Maybe it's that soup, or maybe is about hope. Alexander nodded. Hope is a powerful thing, Frank, and I promise you I'll do my best to live up to it. At that moment, Michael entered the room. Good morning, gentlemen. How are you today? Never better, Michael, Frank replied, especially in anticipation of another culinary masterpiece for breakfast. What are we having today? Cardboard-flavored oatmeal or rubber-flavored toast? Michael laughed. You're in your repertoire as always, Mr. Douglas. Today we have scrambled eggs and toast, and believe me, they're quite edible. Wow, real scrambled eggs? Marveled Frank faintedly. You're spoiling me, Michael. Soon I won't want to leave here." Alexander watched this exchange of remarks with a smile. Even in the face of a serious diagnosis, Frank never lost his sense of humor. It was one of the qualities Alexander was beginning to appreciate in him. "Michael," Alexander addressed the nurse, "could you arrange a meeting with the hospital administration? I'd like to discuss some ideas." Michael raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Of course, Mr. Wolf. But may I ask what ideas we're talking about?" Alexander glanced over to Frank, who nodded approvingly. "I want to discuss the possibility of setting up a charitable foundation to help patients who can't afford the treatment they need." Michael blinked in surprise. "Wow, Mr. Wolf, that's very noble of you. But forgive me for being blunt. How do you plan to organize this?" "Setting up a foundation requires considerable resources and connections." Alexander hesitated for a moment, but then decided to be as honest as possible. "Michael, I'm not exactly who I thought I was. I have certain capabilities, and I want to use them to help people." Michael shifted his gaze from Alexander to Frank and back again, clearly trying to make sense of what he was hearing. I don't really understand what's going on, but if you can actually help, that would be great. I'll talk to the administration and try to set up a meeting as soon as possible." "Thank you, Michael," Alexander thanked sincerely. "I really appreciate your help." As Michael left the room, Frank turned to Alexander with a sly smile. "So, Mr. Mysterious Personality, ready to reveal your cards?" Alexander took a deep breath. "I think it's about time. Frank, my real name is Alexander Volkov. I'm the owner and CEO of Volktech." Frank whistled. "Wow, Volktech? That tech company everyone's talking about? Damn, boy, you're full of surprises." "I didn't mean to deceive you, Frank," Alexander said guiltily. "It's just that I wanted to find out how ordinary people live without the influence of my name and status." Frank scratched his chin thoughtfully. "You know, Alex, or Alexander, I should have known you weren't just an IT guy. There's something special about you. But tell me this, why are you doing all this? Why would a billionaire pretend to be an ordinary patient?" Alexander thought for a moment, choosing his words. "You see, Frank, when you have everything, you start to lose touch with reality. I wanted to understand what ordinary people face in the healthcare system. And you know what? What I saw here opened my eyes to a lot of things." "And what did you see?" asked Frank, looking closely at Alexander. "I saw a system that doesn't work the way it should," Alexander replied. "I saw people like you who can't get the treatment they need because of the cost. I saw dedicated healthcare providers like Michael and Dr. Thompson who give their best, but still can't help everyone in need. And I realized I had to do something about it." Frank was silent for a long time, pondering what he had heard. Finally, he said, "You know, Alexander, I've met a lot of different people in my life, but you're special. You could have just written a check and forgotten all about it, but instead, you came here to understand the problem from the inside. That's impressive." Alexander felt tears come to his eyes. "Thank you, Frank. Your words mean a lot to me." At that moment, Dr. Thompson entered the room. "Good morning, gentlemen. How are you feeling today?" "Never better, Doc," exclaimed Frank, "especially after finding out that my roommate is a secret billionaire." Dr. Thompson raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Excuse me?" Alexander sighed. "Dr. Thompson, I have a confession to make. I am not who I thought I was. My real name is Alexander Volkov, and I'm the CEO of Volktech." Dr. Thompson froze for a moment, clearly stunned by this news. "Mr. Volkov, I don't know what to say. Why did you need this masquerade?" "I wanted to see how the healthcare system works from the inside," Alexander explained. "And what I saw made me think about a lot of things. Dr. Thompson, I want to help. Not just for Mr. Douglas, but for other patients who can't afford the treatment they need." Dr. Thompson slowly lowered herself into a chair, still trying to make sense of the situation. Mr. Volkov, that's very honorable of you. But how do you plan to do it? I want to create a charitable foundation, Alexander replied. A foundation that will help patients pay for their treatment as well as invest in better equipment and conditions in the hospitals. That would be just incredible, Dr. Thompson said quietly. You have no idea how many people it would help. Exactly, interposed Frank. And you know what, Doc? This guy isn't just throwing around big words. He's already offered to pay for my treatment. Dr. Thompson shifted her gaze to Frank, then back to Alexander. Mr. Volkov, I don't know what to say. This would be life-changing not only for Mr. Douglas, but for many other patients. Alexander nodded. That's exactly what I want to accomplish. But I need your help, Dr. Thompson. You know the system inside out. You see the problems every day. Your experience and knowledge will be invaluable in creating a truly effective foundation. Dr. Thompson thought for a moment. Mr. Volkov, if you're really serious, I'll do everything in my power to help, but I must warn you, it won't be easy. The healthcare system is a complex mechanism and changing it won't be easy. I understand, Alexander nodded, but I'm up for the challenge, and I hope I can count on your support. Of course, Dr. Thompson smiled. I'll be happy to help. Now, if you don't mind, I need to examine Mr. Douglas. While Dr. Thompson was busy examining Frank, Alexander pondered the upcoming changes in his life. He realized that starting a charitable foundation would not be an easy task, but he was determined to see it through. After Dr. Thompson left, Michael entered the room. Mr. Wolf, or should I say Mr. Volkov, I've arranged a meeting with the hospital administration for 2 o'clock this afternoon. They are very intrigued by your proposal. Thank you, Michael, Alexander thanked sincerely. Sorry for the deception. I didn't mean to mislead anyone. Michael shook his head. You know, Mr. Volkov, when I found out who you really were, I was angry at first. Thought you were just a rich guy who decided to play the common man. But then I remembered how you interacted with patients, how genuinely interested in the hospital's problems, and I realized that you really wanted to help. I do, Michael, Alexander confirmed. And I'm going to need the help of dedicated people like you. Have you thought about getting involved in running a charitable foundation? Michael blinked in surprise. But I'm just a nurse. No, Michael, Alexander shook his head. You're not just a nurse. You're a person who deals with patient problems every day. You know the system inside out. Your experience will be invaluable to the foundation. Michael thought for a moment. You know, Mr. Volkov, this is a very unexpected offer. But if you really think I could be useful, I'd be happy to help. Excellent, Alexander smiled. Then let's prepare together for the meeting with the administration. Alexander, Frank, and Michael spent the next few hours discussing plans for a charitable foundation. Frank, despite his condition, actively participated in the discussion, offering ideas and sharing his life experiences. You know, guys, Frank said at one point, I thought all my life that the main thing was to make money, to provide for my family. But now I realize that real wealth is being able to help others. Alexander nodded. You're right, Frank. And you know what? You've inspired me with another idea. How about we set up a mentoring program within the foundation? Patients who have been successfully treated could support those who are just starting down that path. Great idea, exclaimed Michael. Psychological support is just as important as medical support. And who better to understand the patient than someone who's been through the same thing? Frank grinned. Well, looks like I have a new retirement job. I'll be a professional inspirational speaker. Everyone laughed, and Alexander felt his heart fill with warmth. He realized that he had found here not only a new purpose in life, but also true friends. At 2 p.m., Alexander, accompanied by Michael, headed to meet with the hospital administration. Before leaving, he turned to Frank. "Thank you, Frank," he said, "for everything." Frank waved his hand. "Go on now, benefactor, and don't forget to tell them how lousy the food in this hospital is." Alexander laughed and walked out of the room. He felt an unprecedented surge of energy and determination. He knew he had a long and difficult road ahead of him, but he was ready for the challenge. The meeting with the administration went better than Alexander could have expected. At first, when he revealed his true identity, a shocked silence hung in the room. But then, as he began to outline his ideas for a charitable foundation, the faces of those present began to change. Disbelief was replaced by interest, and then enthusiasm. "Mr. Volkov," said the head doctor of the hospital when Alexander had finished his presentation, "what you are proposing, it could change the lives of thousands of people. But do you realize the difficulties you will face?" Alexander nodded. "I realize it won't be easy, but I am ready for the challenge, and I rely on your support and expertise." The chief physician glanced over to the other members of the administration, then smiled. "Mr. Volkov, you can count on our full support." After the meeting, Alexander returned to the ward where Frank was waiting for him. "So, benefactor, how did it go?" asked Frank with a smile. Alexander collapsed onto the bed, feeling both tired and elated at the same time. "They've agreed, Frank. We start work on the foundation as early as tomorrow." "Great!" exclaimed Frank. "Now tell me everything in detail." The next few weeks flew by like a day. Alexander was torn between running his company and setting up a charitable foundation. He named it Frank's Foundation, in honor of the man who had inspired this change. Frank began a course of treatment, and although it wasn't easy, he never lost his optimism. Alexander visited him often, and they discussed the plans for the foundation together. 3 months later, Frank's Foundation officially began its work. At the opening ceremony, Alexander gave a speech. "When I came to this hospital as an ordinary patient, I could not have imagined how it would change my life. I met amazing people, patients, doctors, nurses, people who face challenges every day but never lose hope in humanity. This inspired me to create this foundation. But I especially want to thank one person, Frank Douglas." Frank, who was sitting in the front row, smiled embarrassedly. "Frank," Alexander continued, "you taught me to appreciate the simple things, to find joy even in the most difficult situations. You showed me what it means to be truly strong. This foundation is our brainchild, and I promise that we will help thousands of people." After the ceremony, Frank approached Alexander. "You know, kid, when I met you in that ward, I never thought it would lead to this. You really changed my life." Alexander put his arm around Frank. "No, Frank, you're the one who changed my life, and the lives of so many other people." A year later, Frank's foundation helped pay for treatment for hundreds of patients. The hospital received new equipment and patient conditions improved dramatically. Frank successfully completed his treatment and was now working for the foundation, supporting other patients. Alexander continued to run his company, but now spent much of his time on charity work. He often said that his experience at the hospital had made him not only a better manager, but also a better person. And in the room where Alexander and Frank once lay, now hung a sign that read, "Here began a story that changed thousands of lives."